Federal firearms law is a Gordian knot of stupidity. From knee-jerk banning of practically harmless things to loophole closures for laws that have never existed, it is a multi-layered, bureaucratic nightmare. So today I'll be assessing the weapons of the CS2 arsenal to determine how difficult it would be for the average citizen to own each weapon, and putting them onto a tier list. For our tiers, starting at the bottom, we have unregulated, meaning you could literally buy it off the internet directly to your house without issue. Cheap and easy requires an FFL transfer and background check, but no requirements that aren't standard to all firearms that can be had for less than $1,000. Sad wallet, like the previous tier, but for guns that cost more than $1,000. NFA Easy Mode. These items require an NFA tax stamp and registration, but can still be newly acquired with relative ease. NFA Hard Mode. These are NFA items that are affected by the Hughes Amendment, meaning they cannot be newly registered as transferable and are therefore finite, but still cheap for a machine gun. Rich Bastard. The items that you would have to be a rich bastard to obtain due to both NFA status and expense. Unobtainium. These are items that realistically cannot be had outside of extremely unorthodox circumstances or by manufacturing them yourself via becoming licensed to do so. For the pistols, first we have the CZ75 Auto. If this were the normal CZ75, it would be one of the easiest to obtain firearms on this whole list, especially if you are willing to buy a clone. However, the fun switch makes it a hell of a lot more complicated. The select fire variant of the CZ75 was made in very small numbers, and there are no known examples of them that are registered transferable in the US. The standard model would be cheap and easy, but the select fire version is unobtainium. You realistically can't get it. Now for the most easily obtainable long gun, we have the Benelli Nova. The Nova can be had extremely easily. It's currently in production, it's not heavily regulated, and it's quite cheap at $200 to $600. One of the cheapest and easiest in the entire game. First of the rifles, and what better to start with than the oldest rifle in game, the AKM. A running theme with the automatic weapons is that there's typically a semi-auto version available that would put it into a lower tier, and the AKM is no different. A semi-auto AKM would be in sad wallet tier, or even cheap and easy if you get a good deal. But of course, we aren't talking about a semi-auto. Transferable AKM rifles are not hard to come by, but a transferable select fire AKM is really expensive, at anywhere from $40,000 to $70,000, depending on variant and provenance, making it really expensive, even for a machine gun. The AKM is going into rich bastard tier. What might be one of the strangest shotguns that have ever existed, the Mag 7. They were imported in very small numbers and killed by the assault weapons ban and are therefore somewhat difficult to find. However, despite their rarity, they can be had for $3,500. However, they still require a tax stamp by virtue of being a short-barreled shotgun. Therefore, they go into NFA Easy Mode. Next, we have the Deagle. Despite the relatively intimidating appearance and cartridge, the Deagle is no more difficult to get than any other pistol, as it does not have select fire or shoulder stock, and is still being manufactured. Although compared to other pistols, the price tag is a little steep. It might be pricey, but not heavily regulated, so it's going into sad wallet tier. Look, Gordon! The MP5SD! This one has 3 levels of compromise, depending on what your tolerance is. You can get a semi-auto for just under $2,000, plus the cost of the suppressor and registration. You can buy a normal full-auto MP5, then replace the barrel and handguard. Lastly, if you are a rich bastard, you can just buy a transferable MP5SD for $80,000. MP5SD is going into rich bastard tier. Crazy expensive. Now for one of the exclusive lot of approximately 50 billion firearms to carry the name Hebrew Hammer, we have the Galil. Short and simple, the Galil Ace was first manufactured in 2008. The Hughes Amendment was passed in 1986. No transferable Galil Ace rifles exist. You can get a semi-auto one for around $2,000, but the true version is unobtainium. Now for a combo pair, we have the M4A4 and the M4A1S. Since both weapons would basically entail purchasing a transferable M16 receiver, then replacing the upper in stock, the price and availability difference between the two would be negligible. Both are also SBRs, so even if you go the semi-auto route, there's not much difference with the exception that the M4A1S has a suppressor. Both rifles are going into NFA hard mode. This one is probably going to make some of you sad. The French Tickler, aka the FAMAS. The FAMAS is not only difficult to obtain as a semi-auto at anywhere from $50,000 to $80,000, it is basically impossible to obtain as a machine gun with no documented transferable examples in the US. The FAMAS is arguably the saddest of unobtainium tier. Meanwhile, the sawed-off is another really easy to get one unless you're also pedantic. Simply buy a TAC-14 and replace the furniture, and presto, you have a fairly cheap clone of the sawed-off. However, given that the weapon is called the sawed-off, it would not be in the spirit of the video to count that, meaning you would have to buy and cut down a Remington 870. This would require an NFA tax stamp, putting it into NFA Easy Mode. Fuck! Where the SCAR 20 is the same old story. Made after 86, it gets 86. Semi-auto versions are available for around 5K, but the true SCAR 20 is unobtainium. Next up, we have the SIG P250. This is the most easily obtainable pistol and the most easily obtainable firearm in the entire game. These are plentiful without any suppressors, switches, or stocks, the epitome of cheap and easy. Next up, we have my favorite rifle in CS2, the Steyr AUG. Not only is Steyr USA a great company in the modern day, offering newly made civilian versions of the AUG, a full auto one is not as expensive as you might think, at roughly $40,000 to $50,000 for a transferable one. Still rich bastard tier, but not that bad. Like, comment, and subscribe so I can buy a Steyr AUG. Same as the AUG in game, much less than the AUG in spirit. We have the SG553. Same story as the Galil Ace, first built in 1990, therefore could not possibly have any transferable examples before 1986. They can be had in semi-auto for around $1,500, but the true 553 is unobtainium. Next up, we have another shotgun, the XM1014, aka the Benelli M4. A genuine Benelli M4 will run you just shy of $2,000. You can technically get a clone for cheaper, but I would advise against it. It is going in sad wallet tier. Now for what is probably the most iconic CS2 weapon, the AWP. This one is a bit tricky depending on how much you want to split hairs, as what rifle is actually closest to the CS2 AWP in real life is debatable. The name AWP stands for Arctic Warfare Police, which differs from the in-game model by having black furniture and a bare muzzle. The rifle modeled in-game appears to be the Accuracy International Arctic Warfare, which is chambered in 7.62 NATO. The in-game performance most closely matches the AWM Arctic Warfare Magnum by dealing substantially higher damage than the 7.62 NATO rifles in the game and having a 5-round magazine as opposed to the 10-round magazine of the Arctic Warfare and Arctic Warfare Police. Luckily, since the price range is $15,000 to $25,000 for a bolt-action rifle, I feel pretty comfortable putting this into rich bastard tier regardless of what version you think is the true AWP. Moving on, we have another very basic entry. This would be one of the most easily obtainable firearms on this whole list if it wasn't for the fact that you technically have to buy two. The dualies are literally two normal Beretta M9A1 pistols. Nothing about them is intrinsically heavily regulated or difficult to find. If you wanted specifically the wood grips and silver nitride finish, it would be a bit harder, but still not what I would consider difficult or unreasonably expensive. Given that you could buy just one or buy them one at a time, I'll put them in cheap and easy tier, although it would be in sad wallet tier if you bought two at the same time. Next up, the Pore Slayer, the FN57. 20 rounds of supposedly armor-piercing ammunition, and not that difficult to obtain. FN is a very good company, and they have been proactive about producing versions of their most famous models for the civilian market for many years. This means that not only can you readily find newly manufactured FN-produced 5.7s, but they're also not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. Still, quite expensive for a handgun and quite the price for the ammo, but it's still not outside the realm of possibility for your average citizen. Now we have the Burp-O-Matic, the Glock 18C. This one is another that would be extremely easy to find for a good price, if it wasn't for the burst. The Glock 18C was made in really low numbers, even lower than the CZ75 Auto, and in a similar fashion, there are no registered transferable examples in the US. It's really shocking how dramatic the contrast is from how often they are seen in games versus how rare they're seen in real life. The Glock 18C is unobtainium, you realistically can't get it. Next we have the R8. This one's almost like the opposite of the Glock 18C. As while these are not common to see in video games, they are fairly readily available IRL. A somewhat hefty price tag for a handgun, but that's par for the course with 357 revolvers. They are going into sad wallet tier. Now for the weapon that should have been buffed decades ago, but hasn't because competitive Counter-Strike players are stupid babies, the M249. A semi-auto M249 would be in rich bastard tier considering they are over $10,000, however there is exactly one registered transferable M249, so I would consider it to be unobtainium. On a much more positive note, we have the G3 SG1. You could get a semi-auto PTR91 and dress it up like a G3 SG1 for around $3,000 as a conservative estimate, which would be practically similar to how it is depicted in-game. However, the in-game model is select fire despite the comically low fire rate. A full auto G3 SG1 goes for around $60,000, which is obviously a ton of money, so it's going into rich bastard tier. The Mac Daddy, the Eco Go Round, the Mac 10. The Mac 10 is notoriously cheap as far as machine guns go at a relatively scant $10,000 to $15,000. The MAC-10 is NFA hard mode due to its relatively cheap price for a machine gun. The most notoriously unobtainable firearm on this whole list, the HK MP7. Clones, kludges, and cope, all just to try to replicate this thing. And it's probably Valve's fault it's so well known today. The MP7 is unobtainable as there are no transferable examples in the US and there's no semi-auto versions either. As unobtainium as they come. It's okay though, we have the MP7 at home, the MP9. Semi-auto MP9s are available for pretty cheap, but full-auto transferable MP9s do not exist due to being designed after the year 1986 and therefore affected by the Hughes Amendment. The number of unobtainium guns is too damn high. The Squad Wiper, the Push Stopper, the Dhaka Distributor, the Negev. When I have money, I buy the AUG. When I don't, I buy the Negev. But IRL ain't nobody buying a Negev full auto or otherwise. Not only are there no transferable full auto examples in the US, there's no semi-auto versions either. The Negev is unobtainable. Next up, we have the HK P2000. A fairly standard polymer frame 9mm handgun with the only real notable trait being that it is hammer fired instead of striker fired, like you would see with most other pistols of its type. Not heavily regulated and not super expensive, the P2000 is technically in cheap and easy tier, although just barely. Now for the better HK pistol, we have the USP-45. The USP got the HK dominant genes while the P2000 got the recessive gene. The USP, much like most of the other pistols, is a basic firearm due to relatively low cost and high availability. However, it's not that simple, as the USP in-game has a suppressor, which would not only add to the cost, but also require a tax stamp and registration with the ATF. The USP with its suppressor is an easy NFA item. Next up, we have the weapon that practically aims itself, the FN P90. The P90 is available in semi-auto, but not in full auto due to data manufacture and design. You can get semi-auto ones for around $2,000 because FN is a good company, but you still need to register it as an SBR, so at best it's an NFA easy mode item, and at worst it's unobtainium. In a proper country, this would not be the most common tier. Over 100 years of Austrian bolt-action heritage, we now have the Steyr SSG-08. These can be had for around $4,500 and are still being made for the US civilian market thanks to the fine folks at Steyr USA. Very sad wallet indeed. The premier in tactical Pringle storage, we have the PP-19 Bison. The Bison is available in semi-auto both from KUSA and PSA, however due to being made after 1986, full auto transferable examples do not exist. Sad. Next we have a wildly misunderstood firearm, the Tech 9. The Tech 9 has no practical characteristics that would require additional regulation compared to your average 9mm handgun. However, it's stamped sheet metal with a heat shroud and a magazine that's not in the grip. This was terrifying to many state government officials who opted to specifically ban the Tech 9 in some cases, likely purely due to its appearance. They are somewhat expensive, and the version that directly matches the one in-game is a little harder to find, so it's going into sad wallet tier. Last firearm of the list, we have the objectively worst loser cousin of the MP5. The UMP. The UMP was made in 2000 and in my mind is emblematic of how far HK has fallen. Semi-auto versions are out there, but why would you bother? Just get an MP5 for a better gun that costs less money. Unobtainium, and this time I'm not even sad. Just kidding, I'm still sad. But we're still not done. Here we have the Zeus X27. The Zeus X27 is not a real taser, but you can get the same basic device for fairly little money and directly to your house. The Zeus is unregulated, in some states. Lastly, we finally have the knife, the least used and most spent on skins. 90% of CS2 knives are basically mall ninja crap that isn't particularly expensive or heavily regulated, with the exception of the switchblade knife and butterfly knives, which cannot be purchased by mail. The knife is unregulated. Lesser countries can't relate. That's the last of the weapons, and here is the completed tier list. It's rather upsetting how many CS2 weapons just flat out can't be had, regardless of how much money you have or how hard you try. On the upside, many of these have semi-auto versions available, which makes the tier list look like this if you're willing to accept some compromise. Thankfully, there's not as many truly unobtainable guns, but still too many in my book. Subscribe so I can get a Steyr arm.